PlayStation boss wants change he's not willing to make. The head of PlayStation wants to expand its reach with expensive games on hard-to-get hardware. It's a tough task to order, but let's see. Yesterday, PlayStation boss Jim Ryan said he wants his company's games to be to one day be as prolific as music or movies. He would love to see a world where potentially, quote, hundreds of millions of people could enjoy them. It's the type of future a lot of gaming executives talk about, but one that Sony seems to have no interest in actually achieving. Ryan's remarks came during a 20-minute interview with GameIndustry.biz at GI Live London, where despite being billed as a keynote fireside chat, he didn't actually say a whole lot that was noteworthy. What does he think defines PlayStation? Games, community, and brand. What makes the PlayStation 5 so cool? The games, of course. Which one is his favorite? Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, of course. The PlayStation 5 tech showpiece that you can pick up this holiday season for $70. Hey Rhea, what's happening? How are you doing today? You are all over these streams. That's awesome. Showing support. I may end up siding with the author of this article on this one, so we'll see as we drill down into this. Instead of commenting on or being asked about industry issues around crunch, accessibility, or game preservation, the most interesting thing to come out of Sony Interactive Entertainment CEO's mouth was his wish to, quote, see a world where the games that we make at PlayStation can be enjoyed by many tens of millions of people, perhaps hundreds of millions of people. Dude, barely 100 people could even find about PlayStation 5 to begin with, let alone hundreds of millions. Right now, success with the current console model, a really great PlayStation hit, you're talking 10 or 20 million people being able to play that game. We're talking about games stacking up against music. We're talking about games stacking up against movies. Music and movies, they can be enjoyed by almost limitless audiences. And I think some of the art that our studios are making is some of the finest entertainment that has been made anywhere in the world. And to kind of gate the audience for that wonderful art, wonderful entertainment that our studios are making, to gate the audience for that at 20 or 30 million frustrates me. I would love to see a world where hundreds of millions of people can enjoy those games. Man, 20 or 30 million people frustrate you, huh? I mean, you should never, if you're selling 20 million copies of a game and you don't consider that a rousing success, then your business model is flawed. It's an admirable sentiment, especially, as Ryan points out, because of the implications it would have for developers and players, their hobby opening up to a much wider audience. That's potentially really amazing and really powerful, Ryan said, but it also seems bizarrely at odds with Sony's current strategy around the PlayStation 5. The company hasn't made video game streaming a centerpiece, nor has it bet big on PlayStation Now the way Microsoft has with Game Pass. It doesn't rely on many small games or mobile games, and the company only just started bringing some of its biggest blockbusters to PC years after they originally came out. It's no fault of Sony's that the pandemic has led to manufacturing shortages and upend global supply chains. But even if you could find a PlayStation 5 in stores, it represents the high end of console gaming when compared to the Xbox Series S, Nintendo Switch, and Switch Lite. If anything, Sony appears to be doubling down on the prestige blockbuster model, investing heavily in small slate of big releases. PlayStation 4 ended last generation with Marvel's Spider-Man, Ghost of Tsushima, and The Last of Us Part 2, each of which released to strong sales and general critical acclaim. God of War won Game of the Year at the 2018 Game Awards. Herman Hulst, previously head of Guerrilla Games, maker of Horizon Zero Dawn, was promoted to head of Sony Worldwide Studios, and now 2022 is set to bring many sequels to many of these games. With others coming not long after. It might continue to make the PlayStation 5 the coolest console on the market, but it doesn't seem like a recipe for reaching anyone not already on board. Yeah, and Justin and I talked a lot about how everything seems to be distilling into the race for the blockbusters. And it seems like Sony kind of wants the best of both worlds. They want to have these epic blockbusters, but they want these epic blockbusters to be mass market consumables, the way that I guess they perceive the Marvel Cinematic Universe type movies to be, where yeah, they're like $250, $300 million movies, but literally every one of their grandma packs a theater to see them on release. But the barrier for entry for a movie is a little bit different than the barrier of entry for a video game, and the commitment also. Like, you could spend, if you're going to a movie theater by yourself, you could spend $12 on a movie ticket, and your commitment is 2.5 hours maybe, and you get a good narrative with some cool visuals out of it. But that's really it. It's $12 for 2 hours worth of time. Whereas with a video game, even with a blockbuster video, I mean, especially with a blockbuster video game, you have to make it worth people's time, because it's like $70 a game. You drop $70 on a game, you don't want it to be over in 2 hours, especially if you have to buy $600 proprietary hardware. Well, I mean, if you could find a PlayStation 5 right now, it's way more than $600. But I mean, I saw some on Walmart a couple weeks back that were going for like $1,500. So if you spend anywhere between $600 to $1,500 on a proprietary piece of hardware, and then $70 for a game to play on it, you don't necessarily want to only play a 2-hour game. But then with that, you have a game maybe that's 50, 60 hours to complete. That's a commitment. Like, it's way more than like, oh, it's a Saturday night, they got a babysitter for the kids or whatever normal people do. Let's devote 2 hours of our evening to go see a movie. We could eat dinner, go watch a movie for a couple hours, and then have some drinks or whatever, come back home. That's a night. That's a fine night out for most people. But you have a 60-hour game. It's like, okay, I've got to actually make a schedule to commit, like, to playing at least an hour every other day or so, and be heavily invested in trying to complete, get my money's worth out of the upwards of $1,500 that I may have dropped on this thing. It's a much steeper ask for people, and most normal people aren't going to do that. Even if it's a console that's cheaper, I mean, you can, even if you're talking about like playing Zelda on the Switch, like, okay, it's a little cheaper. It's still not $12 for 2 hours, but it's cheaper than PlayStation and PS5 and like a $70 game or whatever. If you just get like an old Zelda or something, you're still gonna have to put that time in, and time is a valuable commodity amongst the normies. So I don't know if there's a world that exists where you can square blockbuster gaming and I mean, this is why years back a lot of game developers started moving towards making mobile games, because they wanted what this dude's talking about. They wanted their games to have mass market appeal, and nothing has mass market penetration like smartphones. Everybody has a smartphone. So if you want to put your game on a platform that's gonna get the most eyes on it potentially, you would put it on a smartphone. You wouldn't put it on a proprietary piece of hardware that somebody has to go out of their way to find and then go out of their way to play. So, I mean, you could probably talk to Zynga or the people that made Candy Crush or whatever about what it's like to have, a video game have the kind of mass market appeal that a movie has. I mean, how many people played Candy Crush? Or Bejeweled. I still have Bejeweled on my phone, and I'll play that every now and then whenever I'm bored. So, I don't know. I don't think this guy... I don't know. Let's see what else he has to say. Sony's focus on blockbuster, I guess, is a quote from this is a quote from Bloomberg. I guess Bloomberg wrote this, contributed to this a bit. Quote, Sony's focus on exclusive blockbusters has come at the expense of niche teams and studios within the PlayStation organization, leading to a high turnover and less choice for players, reported Bloomberg in April. Instead of investing in smaller teams to pursue more experimental projects, Sony has reportedly doubled down on remakes and sequels of its most successful series. Japan Studios, responsible for a range of intriguing smaller projects during the PlayStation 3 and Vita days, was downsized and reshuffled around earlier this year, and some independent developers complained over summer that Sony can be difficult to work with compared with Microsoft and Nintendo. Wow, that's like total opposite of the way it used to be. People used to flee, probably before the first Xbox, but also around the time of the first Xbox, people would flee developing from Nintendo and going and developing their games on Sony's PlayStation instead. And they would also flee Sega, but that would be for a different reason. Sega wasn't difficult to work with in particular, but just nobody had a Saturn, and the Dreamcast was on its deathbed as a result of that. But yeah, a lot of developers would flee Nintendo to go work for Sony. Which is why the PlayStation had like a colossal level of third-party games for like a rookie console, and it continued with the PlayStation 2. Like that shift continued, and that's a part of why the GameCube, coolest system as it may have been, was always kind of seen as like the unwanted stepchild of the PlayStation 2, because a lot of third-party developers just preferred working with Sony over Nintendo. I mentioned that in a comment, actually. I think in the Amico discussion I did with Ryan Max. At some point, I guess I mentioned we were talking about the royalties, and I mentioned that at some point in the past, at a place I worked with, before I got there, they had worked with Nintendo putting out a game, and I always got the sense once I got hired, and we were talking just about, because we were working on a game for PlayStation 2 and Xbox, and I got the sense just talking to team members that were a part of that Nintendo project that they just didn't like working with Nintendo at all, which is why that game that we worked on was only on the Xbox and PlayStation 2. So yeah, that was definitely a big thing back then. It's kind of interesting to see how that may have flipped around now. People are angry with Sony, or at least frustrated with Sony, and saying that they're difficult compared to Microsoft or Nintendo. Ryan spelled out the ideology at the heart of modern PlayStation in an interview with TMT Post around the same time. Players only remember best games rather than okay games, he said. If it is a best game, players may want a sequel, and they will want to buy a sequel, but no one really cares that a game is okay. This line of thinking has its critics, though, including from previous iterations of PlayStation. Right now, we are narrowing ourselves down into genres and sequels in certain types of games, Sean Layton, former CEO of SIE Worldwide Studios, told GameIndustry.biz in July. Favorites like my own, like Parappa and Vibe Ribbon or Vib Ribbon, I don't think I've ever heard of that one. Those things don't seem to get a chance to come out on stage. That's bad for the industry and for fans. Over time, that leads to a crumbling of the games industry if we just keep talking to the same people and telling the same stories in the same way. Layton, who abruptly stepped down from Sony in 2019, a few months after Ryan took over, has been a critic of the burgeoning development budgets, calling for companies to embrace shorter, cheaper games instead. There is so much about this. Oh man, this sentiment has become a rallying cry for others in the industry. I want shorter games with worse graphics made by people who are paid more to work less, and I'm not kidding. Fanbytes Media Jordan Mallory tweeted in June 2020. In August of this year, indie developers answer the call with shorter games, worse graphics bundle. What? Shorter games, worse graphics? That's funny. The shorter games with worse graphics bundle is no joke. 28 short and sweet indie games. What is this? Featuring 28 different games from 25 independent developers starting at $20. The shorter games with worse graphics bundle on itch.io is a celebration of small games from small studios that refuse to be a part of the increasing trouble. The reason why this is like amusing to me, I'll have to check this out. I'll have to see what this is all about. It looks like it could be neat. It was when I was working at BioWare, working on Star Wars The Old Republic. Shortly after the launch of SWTOR, as is the case in the game industry, there were massive layoffs. And we had hired a bunch of people to help us get that game across the finish line. So the layoffs that they did, they had to do it 2 chunks. And the first chunk was just debilitating. And the second chunk was wildly demoralizing. And those of us that survived both of those chunks, like the vibe around the studio was not good, and everyone had a sour taste in their mouth. not just about those the layoffs in particular, because we lost a lot of buddies, a lot of our friends lost their jobs, but they also had a sour taste in their mouth about the business in general and the business strategy of blockbuster game developments. And this was when did SWTOR come out? Like 2012 or something, 2013 maybe, I forget. But one of the people who had that kind of disgruntled sensibility around it was the studio general manager. And I think he had made a determination at the time that, he didn't want to be a part of that anymore. I can't imagine how much, obviously it sucked worse for the people that lost their jobs, but, if he actually cared about the people that, he was a steward, whose employment he was a steward of, and he had to let a bunch of people he liked go, probably really sucked for him too. But I think in an effort to try to not have to do something like that again, he decided that, with the remaining people that we had in our studio, we still had a lot of people working there even after those two massive layoffs. It was basically splitting the studio up into like chunks. Like I want to say thirds, but there may have been more than 3 teams. And, one team was working on supporting Star Wars The Old Republic and continuing to develop patches and expansions for it. And another team was working on, they were working on a mobile game. I think, I forget the name of the EA mobile studio that was in Austin at that time. I can't remember if they were working with those guys or if they became their own little thing, but they were working on like a little Star Wars mobile project on the side. And then like the third chunk of the studio was working on Shadow Realms. And that was a game that actually was announced. They announced that at Gamescom in Germany. And the whole idea around not only this setup, but around what Shadow Realms and the other mobile project were to be, was that the teams were smaller, the scope of the projects were significantly smaller than what a giant MMO would be. So the development process for it wouldn't involve like back-breaking crunch over multiple years and just an exploding budget that requires even more of a return on your investment, and God knows what you need to do in order to make sure you get that return on your investment. Like getting rid of that development environment entirely was the modus operandi. It was the incentive for having these smaller teams. So Shadow Realm, and part of how we were doing that with Shadow Realms, a part of the initial conceptualization and iterative development of it was that it used Frostbite. This was also at the start of when EA was starting to roll out Frostbite to the studio at large. But a lot of the prototyping was also done just recycling assets from other BioWare games, Dragon Age and whatnot, since it was kind of a modern-esque fantasy title. A lot of assets could be reused from Battlefield or in the modern set. I think there were some environments, I believe, that they had planned. I don't recall ever playing any of them. There were some environments they had planned where it takes place in like the modern setting, a city street and whatnot. But then like the parts that I have played were all set in like a fantasy setting, and they were using Dragon Age assets for that too. So they didn't have to like hire a team of modelers and engineers and riggers and all that sort of stuff in order to prototype out a demo. Like they had a lot of the stuff that they were already, using in other areas to be able to sketch out, a concept for their game. Meaning you could use a smaller team. So it was a smaller team that, cranked out, a little vertical slice of the game and concepts and whatnot, and it was going through all of the steps that it had to go through in order to get approved by the executives at EA and whatnot. Another reason why they had it set up this way is because the idea was that these titles would be released in a staggered manner so that when work finished on one game, those developers can roll on to another project, and once work finishes on another project, those developers can, or those developers in the third, like the first roll to the second rolls to the third rolls to the first, and all that sort of stuff. So it's a rotation of labor within your little development ecosystem that reduces your likelihood of having to do a mass layoff after a project gets shipped. So those were like two of the main reasons why he wanted to split the studio up that way, and it was working for a spell. and the whole idea around it. I remember going to several all hands meetings about, the state of the studio and all that sort of stuff. And it was a really big drive, a really big push towards, having a development ecosystem that was more stable. I guess I can't really say equitable, because I don't think that it didn't last long enough to be able to like translate into sales and revenue and whatnot, and see how successful that kind of a model could work. That reason being is because even though we demoed Shadow Realms at Gamescom, and we launched our website at the same time and had a bunch of people signing up for it. There was huge interest in it, but the EA execs at a time were fairly interested in it as well, but they did end up canceling it. And they canceled it because this was around the time when they decided we need to, just like all these other companies are now, just like, the article here was just explaining, they made the determination that we got to go all in on blockbusters. We can't do these small games. We need to spend a lot of money to make sure that we get a good return on our investment on these, multi-million dollar or multi-million unit sales. And with that being the new business plan going forward for EA, there's just no room for what he was trying to do. So Shadow Realms was canceled, and with that cancellation, unfortunately, came more layoffs, and it was brutal, man. That was a brutal, debilitating thing to go through at that time, especially since the thing that sucked about that was that after that second layoff, with morale being as low as it was, and as awful as people were feeling about still sticking around after so many of their friends and coworkers had just gotten laid off. After a while, after a lot of conversations and a lot of work being done around the studio to create that dynamic that I just explained, where people were working on a mobile project, people were working on Shadow Realms and whatnot, we kind of felt like we had at least a little bit of our destiny in our control. And people around the studio were starting to get excited about it, man. Like, people were playing the Shadow Realms demo internally. People had a lot of really cool ideas about it. People were pretty stoked. And after a while, that malaise, that terrible feeling that had hovered around the studio after that second layoff, was starting to go away. People were starting to kind of get their energies about being a developer at a prestige brand like BioWare. They were starting to get that vibe back, and it seemed like maybe they could overcome such a debilitating thing to go through until it was canceled. And then that was just driving a spike in the skull of all of the ambitions of incredible amount of talented people that worked there. Because game developers just want to make cool games. They don't necessarily care if it's a billion-dollar blockbuster game or if it's like a little indie $5 indie game or whatever. They just want to do cool shit. And unfortunately, in some of these bigger environments, your ability to do cool shit is radically truncated by, the marching orders that you get from executives half a world away. And, it's a real bummer, but yeah, it's kind of interesting to see this whole shorter games, worse graphics thing. I guess I missed out on this a year ago. Guess I had other things on my mind a year ago. Particularly in June of 2020, a year ago, when COVID contributed to my job shutting down for good, me entering the unemployment line shortly after half the country burns because of terrible atrocity committed amongst someone that looked like me. I had a little bit other things on my mind than indie games, I assure you, but I'll check this out, check up on it, see what it looks like. I'm glad that, this is at least an idea that's starting to proliferate around the development community a little bit more. But I would definitely like to see bigger companies start to adopt this idea a little bit more too. There was a time when Sony kind of started to embrace it a bit more, and I think they still do in respects to how they operate their PlayStation Store. I remember it was a big thing when uh, Little Big Planet, is that what it was called, with Sackboy or whatever? When that came out, everyone was all about how cool and indie that title was, and even just recently, the last company I worked for, Armature, I believe they just released one of their titles, one of their small indie kind of small footprint sort of titles on the PlayStation Network. So I mean, there is still some capacity for them to support it for certain, but I that's not what they're making their brand. They're making their brand the big blockbusters, and maybe that's the point of contention, like whether Sony should be making their brand the big blockbuster or not. Like, you can have a console for certain where you have your big blockbusters and you have your cool indie titles, and there are a lot of cool indie titles on the PlayStation Network, but if this dude wants people to treat Sony games the same way they treat like a Marvel movie, then you can't just make your brand blockbusters. You have to spend as much marketing dollars on those PlayStation Network indie games as you do on, Spider-Man or whatever else. And that's a hard thing to part with on that money. Video games and the people who make and play them have always had a chip on their shoulder about their status in wider culture. Today, games are a $100 billion global industry. No one but internet sickos ask if they are still art, and Hollywood is desperately snatching up whatever gaming IPs it can. I don't know if they're desperately snatching them up, but they're more open to adapting them now than they have been in the past. But it's still not as ubiquitous as music or TV, especially outside of mobile and PC. The PS4 outsold the PS3 by an estimated 30 million units. I didn't know that. The PS5 might even sell another 30 million units more. But that would still put it behind the best-selling console of all time, the PS2. A console for which, it could be noted, there was the most astonishing array of games of all lengths and budgets, for certain. For us to grow the audience for gaming, we have to go where they are, Layton told GameIndustry.biz back in the summer. We have been here 25 years. They know where we are, and they haven't come yet. And there's a reason. We need to discover and interrogate that reason. Well, I mean, dude, a part of that reason is also just your shit's too expensive, man. Like, you want to go to people where they are. Look at fucking the skyrocketing inflation in all sectors of our economy. Look at stagnant wage growth, income inequality, wealth disparity. Like, people have to be a lot smarter about how they spend their money nowadays, and a lot of times what's first on the block is the superfluous entertainment expenses. Like, do you really want to spend, again, between $600 and $1,500 for the privilege of spending $70 on a game that you have to devote time you don't have to, in order to get your money's worth out of that? Or do you want to spend $12 watch an MCU movie? Or spend $12 a month and watch all the MCU movies and all the Disney movies and all the Star Wars movies? You could do that. You have your options there. And if you want gaming to compete with all of these other things, you have to look at all of these other things as competitors. Like, what value do your competitors at Disney Plus have that you don't at PlayStation, at the PlayStation 5, at Sony, at the PlayStation Store? Ease of access is one. And I think that's an important point that he makes in his article about not having a streaming service, I haven't tried the Google Stadia, but I at least applaud them for moving in that particular direction. And it's a bummer that when Microsoft was trying to go towards that direction in the Xbox One, that they got a whole lot of pushback on it. I feel like if the game industry wants to compete with the streaming services and movie and television, that's the only way to go. You're going to have to go streaming. You're going to have, a little cheap box. It's going to have to be cheap. It's going to have to be like at least $50-$60. And people are going to pay a subscription to log on to it. And then, have whatever access to games. That you can have on there for free. Like, I think that's what Amazon has realized. When they have people who have Amazon Prime accounts, you get them free access to New World, their MMO. And Netflix, I think, understands that as well, which is why they bought the Oxenfree developer. I mentioned that in a video I posted not too long ago. I pointed behind me, like the video is behind me. That's weird. But yeah, they purchased the Oxenfree developer, and whatever game that those guys are going to make is going to be available for every Netflix subscriber as a part of their subscription package. The only way you're going to be able to compete with those guys. And you know, games aren't cheap, especially blockbusters. They're expensive to make, and they're incredibly time intensive to make. And the more time intensive it is, the more expensive it is, obviously. And I think the game industry expectation on sales and returns on that sort of stuff is a little bit it's a little outdated. Like you I don't know. I would have to do a little bit more research on that before I actually make any further comment on that regard. But yeah, I understand what this guy at Sony wants out of his brand, but I don't think he's going about. I mean, it's pretty clear that the company isn't going about the right way getting there. Hey guys, thanks for watching this video. If you liked what I said, what Justin said, if you like the content we're providing, if you had any kind of laughs at all, even if you hate us, if you hate my guts, if you want to stab me, if you want to say all sorts of horrible things to me, cool. Like the video, subscribe. You'll get fed all sorts of shit you'll probably hate. And if you like us, you'll get fed all sorts of shit you probably like. So please and thank you.